Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is Joel Garbon. I've known Joel for 5 or 6 years now. We met initially back in 2013 for an event known as the Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference, which was in Boulder, Colorado. And I will just tell you, that conference was an eye-opener for me, without a doubt. I learned so much about what's going on in this world in terms of brilliant people who are looking to create new energy paradigms in this world. And Joel is one of them. He's an inventor. We can talk about his inventions, I hope. Joel served as president of an organization called the New Energy Movement for 11 years. And this is all about educating the public, educating policymakers about breakthrough energy technologies and their implications for human society and our world. He's also served as an advocate for inventors of those technologies. So in addition to all of that, he's a founding member of an organization called the New Energy Congress, which is a forum of technical professionals who investigate new energy technologies. He's the co-author of a book, along with investigative journalist Gene Manning, entitled Breakthrough Power: How Quantum Leap New Energy Inventions Can Transform Our World. He's got a website, breakthroughpower.net. And there's a lot more about Joel. I've recently just spent some time with him again a few weeks ago, and he is a great guy to talk to, very interesting, knows energy very, very well, and I think we'll really enjoy listening to him. So Joel Garbon, thank you so much for being on the program.
Hey, Richard. Great to be here with you today.
Yeah, what a pleasure. I wasn't kidding. 5, 6 years ago during that conference where we met, it was a real head-turning, eye-opening experience for me. I didn't have any knowledge of, the real boots-on-the-ground type of work that people like yourself are doing to create true breakthroughs in energy. And I just wonder if you would mind giving people an idea of your background as an inventor, your background in looking into energy, new forms of energy, and also maybe the new energy movement itself. What's that all about?
Sure. All right. Well, I guess I'll start with how I even got interested in this. I've had an academic career mostly in chemistry. And so getting out of college, I went right into the chemical industry as a consultant, specifically working with the pulp and paper industry to help them figure out how to use less chemicals to get the job done in making paper. And I was traveling all throughout North and South America for actually about 20 years. And during the mid-90s, when I was traveling down to Brazil, I was flying late at night over the Amazon in this jumbo jet. Whole plane is asleep, and I'm just looking down, and I can see the Amazon forest on fire. Fires everywhere. And now I had heard about that going on because it was a front page topic on National Geographic and Time magazine and other popular media at that time. So I was aware of the issue, but to actually be seeing it in the middle of the night from 35,000 feet looking down, it really, really struck me that, my God, this is real. This is, and I had a visceral reaction to that.
Sure.
And I said something to the creator, and I'm a prayerful man. I think you may have come to know a little bit about that with me, Richard, as we've gotten to know each other. But I just said a quick little prayer, and it was essentially, whatever I can do with what I know and where you place me, help me to heal this. And I had that prayer go on for actually a number of years. And then I had, I guess, what you would call a personally profound experience where I got a very direct communication that was not human and that said, okay, you're to help bring a new form of energy to this planet. And I was startled, of course, didn't really know what else to do but to say, oh, you mean solar energy, something like that? And the voice essentially laughed and said, no, not solar energy, but you'll see. And then I had this profound wave of energy and a type of embrace that was very loving, kind of unspeakable, and I'm kind of tripping over it as I try to describe it here. But at any rate, what happened then was very quickly I found myself in the midst of these breakthrough energy researchers without me really trying to seek them out, and me having essentially no scientific grounding in energy science itself, while I had a very substantial grounding in chemistry, but really not in energy. But yet, very soon I found myself being invited by some of these other researchers to collaborate with them, and that included like Brian O'Leary, who was one of the original Apollo astronaut candidates, Gene Manning, who was a well-known investigative journalist in this. Tom Vallone, who's another well-known scientist, physicist who publishes quite a bit about breakthrough energy, and others as well. And even in some who you would know who are in the UFO ET research area, like Stephen Greer, also invited me to collaborate with him on energy-related projects. So there was this very, very interesting appearance suddenly of all these people working on this that I found myself in the midst of. And back in 2003, Brian O'Leary and several others and myself collaborated to start what now is known as the New Energy Movement. And what this is, it's a nonprofit that has the mission to educate the public and policymakers about the serious issue that is going on the planet in any number of big areas, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's the huge disparities in living conditions, whether it's the geopolitical instabilities, all these things that are related to the way energy works on our planet. And our mission was to educate folks about alternatives to this and solutions to this by focusing on truly breakthrough energy technologies that essentially leapfrog the conventional energy sources of fossil fuels and nuclear power and even solar and wind, which are basically conventional renewables. So that's really how New Energy Movement came about. We launched it in 2003. Brian O'Leary served as the first executive leader of New Energy Movement for the first year and a half, and then I took over for the next 11 years. And then just a couple of years ago, finally passed the baton to Susan Manowich, who's a very, very skilled and competent person who's really moving this forward in a new creative direction.
I know Susan as well. I have a lot of respect for her.
Yeah, she's really great. So that's kind of how this thing came about, and we've had lots of amazing experiences along the way. I would say, individually and collectively, have formed relationships with dozens of inventors, many of whom are maverick scientists who are stepping away from the mold as far as academic research and corporate research. And then others are just these brilliant kind of garage hobbyist inventors who really aren't constrained at all by conventional scientific and engineering thinking, and they're just kind of doing their own thing and using their own inspirations and insights to put gadgets together in a new way. And there's some remarkable things that have come out of all realms, whether they've been by conventional, highly trained and educated scientists and engineers, and then some of these other folks who don't have much in the way of formal education, but are very hands-on and they're very brilliant in their own way. And I've seen a lot of things firsthand that work. These have demonstrated proofs of principle that they can produce, in several cases, more energy on the output side of the device than what apparently is going in the input to the device. Now, that's not to say that energy is being created, because I think that's kind of a misunderstanding of this principle of over unity.
Right. Can you explain over unity actually a little bit? This is a really, I feel like this debate over unity and breakthrough energy and so-called free energy has caused a lot of noise on this subject from a lot of very skeptical people who I'm just in my own searches on the web on breakthrough energy. There's quite a few of them who really take delight in calling folks who are interested in breakthrough energy cracks and cranks and loons and all of this. And I mean, clearly these are propaganda type smears, but there's also, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding as I see it, where this idea of over unity is always rejected by them because that violates the second law of thermodynamics. I hear this over and over again. You cannot create energy, within it. This is a closed energy system, and energy cannot be created or destroyed. And if over unity, my understanding of it is that you're getting more energy out of it than the entire amount of potential energy that goes into it, and that's impossible. And as a result, you've got all of these people saying, you guys are quacks, you don't know what you're doing. Is that more or less an accurate characterization of how they do it? And I just feel like it doesn't strike me as an outsider here as a fair characterization. You know, when 30 years ago, all the big thing about cold fusion came out, and then Fleischmann and Pons were like, debunked supposedly by the entire scientific establishment because this was supposedly over unity as well, and they couldn't replicate it quite right. I feel like there's more going on in these issues. I don't think it just feels to me that the language we're using when we talk about over unity is stopping us from really understanding the potential benefits for a lot of these technologies.
Well, that's true. You know, vocabulary always is important to the way people perceive things, and especially when it's something that seems very obscure and mysterious, and then you're trying to put it in terms where people can understand a concept in very few words or a soundbite. Over unity, while it does generally describe that we are having a ratio of output energy to input energy that is greater than one being unity. Mm-hmm. So anything that it can be apparently measured that shows greater energy output than input, that would then be classified as over unity.
Which I understand we've never officially achieved. Is that accurate? Like we've not.
Well, no, that's not the case.
Okay.
It has been achieved, but the important thing here is to not try to contend with well-established theories of the conservation of energy. And we make no claim that, hey, there truly is energy being created with these type of devices. But what is evident is that human capability with existing technology and measurement, our ability to measure all forms of potential energy input is quite limited.
Exactly. This is what I'm thinking as well.
We can't measure all the potential frequencies that might exist that could impact a device. But what we're very good at is measuring conventional forms of energy in the way of heat, light, electricity, and mechanical power. We're very good at measuring those output forms of energy. So it's important that we distinguish that we're not saying that we're creating energy. We're simply seeing that energy is being transformed from some very difficult type of energy that's being input to something that's very easy to measure with conventional measurement techniques on the output side. That's all we're saying. And whether it's considered over unity or free energy, and I hate that word free energy because it definitely implies that there's no cost, but that's not true.
Right.
But people need to get beyond these words and labels and really take a look at, hey, is there something real here that's of value? And the answer to that is definitely yes. Yeah,
I appreciate your explanation of this. I agree with this. I have a much more limited understanding of the matter than you do, but it really does make sense to me that It's kind of a straw man argument. A lot of these folks out there saying you're violating, or you can't violate the second law of thermodynamics and all of that. I just want to shift gears very slightly. When you look at the history of energy consumption in human civilization over the last 100 or even 200 years, I mean, anyone who is bothered to think about this can realize our energy consumption globally has gone multiple times. I'm just looking at one particular chart here, which measures in exajoules per year. That sounds like a lot of energy. So in the year 1900, I'm trying to interpret this chart. It seems like it's maybe roughly 30 to 35 exajoules a year. And, we're probably hitting 600 exajoules a year now. So it would be a factor of 20. So from the world of 1900, we are producing or throwing out probably at least 20 times the amount of energy that we did. That would be 20 Earths of 1900. And in fact, I would even think maybe it's higher than that, but it's an enormous amount of energy that we're consuming. That breakdown, the biofuels element of that breakdown has actually not changed much over the many, many years. We do produce more energy in biofuels now than in 1900, but not a lot more, it seems to me. That's been pretty consistent. The new additions have been, of course, coal, oil, natural gas, and then to a much more limited extent, hydroelectric and nuclear. And those are the big ones that are producing the energy in this world. And the question is this, coal, oil, natural gas are the so-called fossil fuels and hydrocarbons that leave a significant environmental impact. Of course, we could put nuclear fission in the mix as well. But the question is how much can you have? How long can you have this type of growth before we start hitting the wall? I remember people talked about peak oil a number of years ago. I don't really know where that is anymore, but it does seem to me, just in principle, that these hydrocarbons have to be a finite source, and I don't really see how it's feasible for our society to continue at this level of growth. And the problem with that is, lots of people say, well, we don't have to continue at this level of energy growth. But there is pretty much a very strong relationship between energy and economic growth, a very strong inverse relationship. So when energy is cheap, the economy grows and people are happy. When energy is expensive, the economy shrinks and people are not happy. And so if we continue, I don't see how we can continue, I suppose, with unlimited energy growth without some kind of breakthrough energy solution, which is exactly the kind of thing that you and your colleagues are looking into.
Well, that's true. And fundamentally, what defines a first world nation is its energy consumption. That's what's powering the economy of our way of life now. And we have a growing population, certainly, since the 1900 that you referenced here, a lot more people, but we have a lot more industrial processes, a lot more transportation options. All of our Western civilization, at least, is powered by electricity, and it requires some type of energy input to generate that electricity or to get that vehicle to move. And largely, it is the fossil fuels that's producing the energy. Generally, stuff's being burned. Even in the case of nuclear, you could kind of consider the nuclear fuel as being burned in a way, although not combustion. But these things are being chemically converted to release heat that's used to generally boil water, to produce steam, to turn a turbine, to produce electricity. And then in the case of our vehicle fleets, whether they're on the land or up in the air or in the sea, we're basically using the fossil fuel to be combusted to produce mechanical power to turn a drive shaft or a propeller or a turbine engine for a jet, things like that.
Yeah.
And we're largely dependent, about 80%, on fossil fuels. And there's been much talk over the last, certainly the last 10 years for sure, about making a big dent in converting away from the fossil fuel imprint that we have and go more toward conventional renewables, which are largely wind and solar, some geothermal, but mostly wind and solar is where most of the investment and the engineering interest has been. But even in those cases, those are centuries old technologies. Wind power, solar power, those have been around for a long time. We don't consider those breakthroughs at all, even though there have been incremental and steady improvements in the engineering and the material science that's gone into both wind and solar. And so the cost generally has come down, and the efficiency has generally gone up in wind and solar, but they still have a lot of problems with the intermittency of wind and solar, because it's only going to work when you got the wind blowing or the sun shining. You have to figure out how you store excess power that you generate from those, which means you need batteries, or you need to use excess electricity to pump water up a hill, essentially, and store it there, and then use it, later. And then, you're looking at the very, very land-intensive installations for any large-scale wind or solar. So where I live in the Pacific Northwest here of the U.S., if you drive down the Columbia River, you will see these large stretches where there's these wind turbines, giant wind turbines all over the place.
Oh, yeah, now, for sure. They're everywhere.
Yeah, they are. Now to me, there's two reactions I have. One is, okay, well, we're generating some clean energy there, but it's also ugly as hell. To me, the aesthetics of having the landscape, paved over by giant wind turbines or big solar panels over huge swaths of a desert or whatever, to me that's not very appealing. And there's an environmental sacrifice that's made. If you were to see, like with the wind turbines, how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of raptors and bats are demolished by those big blades, and that's something that is not released to the public generally.
No, but everyone knows about it. We've been hearing about this type of thing for years. My question is, how effective, or how efficient, I guess I should say, are these wind turbines? I've really wondered, and I honestly have no idea how much energy do they produce. Are they efficient? And are they even cost effective, or do they lose money? Because I've heard arguments that they're really not all that efficient in terms of return on investment and energy that is produced by them.
Yeah, I think I've heard these same things too. Of course, I don't do anything with the installation or maintenance of wind farms, but I have talked to other people who are in that business, where they would say, off the cuff, look, the only reason that this has even gotten its big investment head start that it has over this last 10 years was because of the subsidies.
Exactly.
But really, if there hadn't been government subsidies for wind in particular, you probably would see only a small fraction of what's actually been installed.
Well, I mean, it's a fair argument for any society could make a decision to subsidize clean energy. So I don't think in and of itself it's necessarily a bad thing, but it is indicative that the method of obtaining energy that way may not be all that efficient.
Right.
That's all right. I wonder. What about geothermal sources? Is that something that's more conventional as well? Before we get into some of the exotic things, I mean, I'd like to ask you about cold fusion and maybe over unity electromagnetic motors and magnet motors and whatever. But, some of the conventional ones, when you hear like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos started their $1 billion initiative, supposedly, I don't even know what that's involving, but I'm assuming more solar, maybe geothermal, wind, maybe even fracking. Who the heck knows? I don't know if that's considered an energy breakthrough. But is geothermal a viable source? Can that be exploited to produce a lot of energy for our society?
Well, it can be, depending on the region. So you look at Iceland, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
That is geothermal is what powers that nation.
Uh-huh.
So it's been done for a long, long time, and it's very efficient, very economical, because you have an essentially inexhaustible well of
Right.
of of natural heat energy from the earth itself. And there's lots of places, especially in the U.S. West, where that is. There are projects that are looking to tap in to geothermal, and
Mm-hmm.
largely I think those projects make sense if they can round up the investors to do it. The only real downside with geothermal is if you're not careful, there's a potential to contaminate the groundwater in that area. And
Uh-huh.
I'm very sensitive to things that impact water because actually I feed my family through my work in the water treatment industry. So
Mm-hmm.
very, very aware of all the different things that go on to compromise the water quality in North America. But geothermal in general, I think has some regional benefits and opportunities. And there's great reason to look at a wide portfolio of energy sources that are clean and renewable,
Yeah.
rather than say, oh, it's all got to be this way. It's all got to be wind. Or everyone's got to have a solar panel on the roof and all this kind of thing. We should be looking at the full mix. And that mix needs to include these breakthrough energy technologies that generally are very obscure. They've been woefully underfunded. And in many cases, for the ones that show real breakthrough promise, some of them have been intentionally, well, let's just say, held back.
Right. I want to ask about those in just a moment. I have one other question in terms of conventional technologies that I would just like to ask you about to satisfy my own curiosity. And that does include solar energy. But solar energy, I've heard that with future developments in things like nanotechnology, might actually be able to be efficient enough that it could be orders of magnitude beyond what we currently have. Have you heard about this? Is this realistic or?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's been tremendous advances in material science
Mm-hmm.
and nanotechnology as well. So there's a lot more research that has come online here in industrial applications that's improved the efficiency of solar panels. There's technologies that now where you can actually paint a photovoltaic polymer onto surfaces. So you could actually have solar gathering clothing that could maybe power a device. So you could put it on your on your rooftop or on virtually anything. I mean,
Wow.
you could convert so many surfaces that are exposed to sunlight to being photoreceptive and then be able to produce electricity off of that. And that's because of the advances in material science, and then the cost comes down over time as those technologies get some steam under them and scale up. So yeah, I mean, and solar already, I mean, solar has come down in cost tremendously over the last 2 decades. And now any large-scale solar farm is producing electricity at grid parity, meaning it's the same cost or even lower than conventional coal-fired or natural gas power.
That's truly
So,
impressive.
yeah, it is. It is, and that's in large part due to the improvements in material science and engineering that's been done.
Mm-hmm.
And so those have been great changes.
Well, that's
And
that's really important because the cost of producing has always been the thing that held solar energy back, I believe. And if it's able to produce energy as cheaply as coal or natural gas or oil, that's quite significant. So, yeah.
yeah, it's been the cost, and it's been the intermittency, and then the storage issue.
Oh, right.
Those are two of the other things, and then the footprint, the actual landscape footprint that it takes for any large scale installation. Now, if you're
Okay.
putting panels on rooftops, like California wants to do that with all new development, is have solar panels on them, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
But for any of these solar farms, you're covering over pretty large areas of the landscape, and oftentimes it's in these areas like desert areas where there's an impact on the biological community and the environment there as well.
Right.
But that's just there's always a cost. There's always a trade-off of some sort.
May I ask you now, because I appreciate how you were able to cover some of these conventional alternative sources of energy. Can we get into some of the more exotic alternative sources of energy that typically are, I think, dismissed even after all these years by conventional science, mainstream media, corporate media, and so on? But I've never been convinced that these are just pie in the sky. What I learned when I met you and a lot of other folks 6 years ago is how many truly brilliant individuals are at work on producing, frankly, a wide range of energy solutions. And I remember just coming away from that thinking, not all of these can be nonsense. And in fact, maybe most of them aren't nonsense. And I'm thinking of cold fusion or other over unity types of motors. And I just wonder if you could talk about that and focusing on the ones that you feel have the most promise.
Yeah. Well, I think you've mentioned cold fusion a few times. I think that's the place to start.
Okay.
Because it's been, people are familiar with the term, but it's also been so widely disparaged as well. I think, having some good background on this is a good place to start. So even right now where we are, here we are in 2019. It was actually 30 years ago in March of 1989 when cold fusion was first announced to the world by Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann at the University of Utah. And these were a couple of electrochemists who were doing some neat experiments using heavy water and an electrolysis type of setup. So they're applying a voltage through a palladium electrode in this heavy water. And after a few days of that system running, they found that there were these very high anomalous heat bursts that came out of the experiment that they could not account for by any conventional chemical reaction. And so they thought
it's excess heat.
Heat definitely was very vast excess heat in these pulses basically that even in some cases resulted in meltdown of the whole experiment. And they were very excited, and they very quickly put out a press release that they had discovered essentially what became known as cold fusion, and that this was going to basically become the new energy source of the future and take us in the bold new world of no fossil fuels and cheap clean power for everybody. Well, the media jumped all over this. The conventional physics community, especially nuclear physics community, jumped all over this. And within a matter of days, these guys, Fleischmann and Pons, were so castigated by their pronouncement that they basically had a boulder called junk science land right on their heads. And ultimately, it drove them out of academia. And they were really demonized and blackballed. And part of this is because they weren't careful, and the university themselves, in their own interest, because there's lots of competition in the science field. Who's going to make the new breakthrough announcement, all the intellectual property, and it goes back to the money trail. Why do people do some of these things faster than they should? And so while they were doing interesting research, and they certainly had some anomalous results, the politics of academic science jumped into the fray very aggressively, very early, and then the response from academic science, and that being the conventional nuclear physics research community, they just pounced back on it and said, no. These electrochemists can't possibly have come up with anything that supersedes, nuclear research. And so there was this very ugly battle that happened, and Fleischmann and Pons lost. However, they had generated such a buzz in various institutions around the world, including a lot of the major universities globally, a lot of tech companies, and by tech in this case, I mean these would be companies like the Sony, Mitsubishi, big industrial conglomerates, and Texas Instruments, others who had their own laboratory facilities, lots of resources, and they could start to investigate this. And our own military took a heavy interest in this. In fact, some of the best research on cold fusion has been done by the U.S. Navy research labs. Mm-hmm. And they have contributed a lot to the science and understanding, and they've made some of their own pronouncements about the fact that this field of research is valid, and that there are indeed these excess heat outputs that you get from certain well-controlled experiments. Now, the problem with cold fusion is that the term implies that there's actually nuclear fusion going on, and that's been hotly debated for these 30 years. Mm-hmm. But the most recent theories now that are gaining most acceptance is that in the process itself, you are not actually having nuclear fusion occur, but rather what's happening is that there is a process where the hydrogen atom itself that's present, in the water that's often used, or the hydrogen gas that's used in various types of these cold fusion processes, because there's many different variants of it. But basically what's happening is electrons and protons are merging to create neutrons.
Wow.
And that's quite different than actually having the nuclear fusion of hydrogen atoms occur, like what happens in a star, like our sun. So nuclear fusion in a star, you have light elements, protons actually fusing together to form heavier elements, and it releases a tremendous amount of heat and light.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about in cold fusion. In fact, even that term now is not preferred. It's normally called low energy nuclear reactions, LENR.
Heard about this many. Yeah, this is the preferred.
Yeah. So in that process, what's considered now, there's actually a theory called the Widom-Larsen theory that describes this process where you're having just protons, electrons merging together. They create neutrons, and then those neutrons get captured by the metal that's used in these processes. So usually there's either some type of nanoparticles of a metal like nickel, or there might be a thin film of metal that's part of the process. And basically, after the metal captures those neutrons, there's gamma rays that are released, and then the gamma is captured by nearby electrons, and the energy gets re-radiated as heat. And so the classic thing that you find in these experiments, the well-designed ones that have some elements of good control, is you get consistent excess heat output, but you don't get dangerous radiation coming off that could be harmful to the researchers and others.
May I just jump in for a moment and ask you? So I've noticed, that there's definitely been a slight change in how our society talks about the cold fusion or low-energy nuclear reactions. It's not quite as dismissive as it would have been even 10, 15 years ago. Definitely I noticed that. But the thing that I have been picking up over and over is that there have been many attempts to replicate these, and it's been hit or miss, and a lot of misses. And I think this has been the problem that mainstream science has with it. Is it the fact that this is just an inherently difficult type of experiment to make, Are there too many
Yeah,
variables? Is it just too complicated at this point?
good question, because the early experiments, and again, there were many different variants of these types of processes that have come under this general label of cold fusion or low energy nuclear reactions. Because the science wasn't very well understood, it was mostly just kind of experimental, almost kind of trial and error process without a good governing theory of what's happening. The processes themselves were not reliable, and so you would get more anomalous type of heat output rather than continuous, controlled, repeatable output. But now there's been a lot of good research, and there are processes that are much more repeatable and consistent.
Right.
And so there's much better control of the reactant environment here, the other inputs that go into this. Lots of technical aspect to it, but what I can tell you is that the process is much more repeatable now, and there's a few favored platforms now versus the wide variety of different experiments that arose earlier in the day. And so now what you'll hear, there's been pronouncements from NASA at their Langley facility by the chief scientist there, saying, hey, this is a viable technology.
That's interesting.
Had announcements, by the U.S. military, more particularly the Navy, and the Navy's put a lot of research time and resource into this, and they also say, hey, this could be used as a way for to produce energy for our fleets.
When you're talking about the Navy wanting to produce energy for their fleets, you've got to assume there's a lot of energy. They need huge amounts of energy for their nuclear submarines or their battleships and aircraft carriers. So
that's the thing. I mean, to have the current fusion science has not come about yet. There's been billions and tens of billions of dollars put into conventional hot fusion research, trying to replicate what goes on inside our sun. And that always seems to remain 30 years down the road.
That's been a holy grail since the 50s, as I understand it. Well, it seems to me that the cold fusion or low energy nuclear reactions is a genuinely valid direction. It doesn't sound like a fully mature science yet, but
Correct.
It does. I would agree. Like, it seems that the tide has turned in terms of our public perception on it, and that this could be a genuine applicable science at some point in our future. And assuming if we get to that point, I would imagine this would be a revolutionary development in our society. Is that right? Do you think?
Yeah, I believe that to be the case. Otherwise, you want to find some folks really, good scientists who have reputations to protect. They would not be putting their neck on the line by making pronouncements like we've heard out of NASA and out of the U.S. Navy. So it's got some time yet to incubate, but don't count it out, because I think it's going to be coming.
Now, are there others? I just want to ask. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes here. I just want to wonder if are there other possibilities, any electromagnetic motors or magnets or whatever.
Yeah, there are. The one here is called Brilliant Light Power. In fact, anyone can look at the website brilliantlightpower.com. And what this is a company and a process that was developed by a brilliant scientist named Randall Mills. Randall Mills is a Harvard-educated medical doctor, MIT-educated engineer, who developed a process going back. It's now been over 20 years now. He developed a process called the Backlight power process, which has some similarities to the low energy nuclear reaction type of technology, but with some significant differences. But he uses hydrogen. He uses a metal source as well, like what the low energy nuclear reaction science does, and he uses voltage in the system. And basically what his process does is it reacts hydrogen with a catalyst in the presence of some nano scale metal. In the case of his device right now, he uses silver. And what happens is there is a very, very powerful plasma that's generated, a brilliant plasma, as in generates an amazing amount of light intensity to it. And thus, it's called the brilliant light
I
power
see.
process. And then their plans are to commercialize this as a technology that they call sun cell. And what it does is basically it will be able to replace solar farms and other forms of power generation with a process that is much, much lower capital cost. Like and right now, somewhere maybe 30 times lower cost than a solar farm.
Wow.
And the electrical power that's generated would be about 1/10 the cost of conventional power generation. And it has a very, very small footprint because there's such high power density. So some of the claims by the company are just, they're just mind-boggling in the promise for this. Now, this guy's been heavily funded. He's got an all-star board of directors, even like former, like admirals and former energy secretaries.
I'm looking at the website. It's a very, very nice looking website. I'm not sure I understand. They talk about electrical power from hydrogen to dark matter. That sounded a little esoteric to me, but I can't. It's not for me to understand all of the science involved here.
Well,
but
that's the other amazing part of this is Randall Mills. He's a brilliant chemist, and he has developed his own grand unified theory of physics that basically solely rejects quantum theory and basically takes classical physics theory, all the way from the astrophysics level all the way down to the atomic level, and it's quite fascinating. But in this process, the black light power process, what he says happens to the hydrogen atom itself is that the process reduces the size of the atom, that the electron itself will collapse to a lower energy level than what is normally associated with the ground state of the electron orbit. So think of it this way. Normally, in a hydrogen atom, you got the electron moving around in this cloud that is a certain distance away from the nucleus. After the black light power process is applied, that hydrogen atom now has the electron orbiting much tighter toward the nucleus. And it's a very chemically stable form of hydrogen that he calls hydrino. And he says hydrino is dark matter. He says that all the stars in the universe, all these hundreds of billions and trillions of stars, that in their process for creating energy, that they are producing hydrinos, and that is what dark matter is.
Well, I don't really care if he's right or not. The only thing I would care about is if his system works, and if it does work, and if it's working the way that you're talking about, producing electricity at up to 30 times less the cost of how we currently do it, that's another example of a game changer, it would seem to me. Electrical power that cheap would be radical. It would be a radical transformation of our world. Joel, in a few minutes that we have left, are there any real chances that we have in the near future, 5-10 years from now, that a true breakthrough energy solution to our world's needs can be announced and maybe at least the beginnings of an implementation? Or are there just too many obstacles, both technological and or political or whatever? I mean, is it possible? It seems to me that it would be an important development that we would want to try to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible, and I've been in this now for some 20 years, and definitely thought it would come about by now. But this has been a slow process because of a number of obstacles and entrenched opinions, and also very heavily moneyed and powerful vested interests. If you think of fossil fuel, that is probably a $12 trillion global industry, not eager to be displaced by anything. So when whole nations have their economies
$12 trillion a year, did
yeah,
you say? My God.
yeah.
Wow.
So
Okay.
there's whole nations whose economies are dependent on fossil
Right.
fuel. And of course, we know the names of most of those, right? OPEC nations, et cetera.
Sure. Sure.
And here, even in the U.S., it's a multi-trillion-dollar
Yeah.
industry. So the breakthrough energy technologies exist, and I believe also a number of these have already been developed to a high degree of engineering and practical application, and likely are already being used in certain venues, programs by different agencies or whatever. But that
Yeah,
largely
classified
those activities are
technologies, you patent it, you classify the patents, and you prevent
yeah.
people from exploiting that technology.
Right, and you can say, okay, it's for national security interest or blah blah blah, and that all
Yeah.
happened in the cold fusion field as well. That's a whole other story we go into another time. But anyway, these technologies do exist; they're real. But part of what has to happen is for there to be enough of a movement of the populace to insist that these things be brought to light. And even if the wizard's not going to throw the curtain open, that at least there be substantial funding that is put toward these technologies so that mainstream research can be done. Because most of the inventors of these they're starving. They're operating on fumes of funding to
Right.
try to move these things forward. Many of them are working in isolated conditions. Many of them have had some shenanigans occur to them where they're very paranoid. Many of them already are quite eccentric in their personalities to begin with, and I've met many of them like that.
Mm-hmm.
And even as a strong advocate for the maverick inventor, and as an inventor myself, so I have a great deal of empathy with what they have to go through. It's been difficult to form relationships of trust with many of the inventors. So if you don't have the key technologist who can easily work with a high performance team, you really don't move things very far down the road. And that's been one of the things. I mean, has there been suppression? Yes. Has there been a lack of funding? Yes. Has there been a lot of labels of junk science by the media and academic interests and all that? Yes. But also, have the inventors often been their own worst enemy? Yes, yes, yes. And so there's lots of opportunities here to open this up, but it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to need resources and people who are willing to dedicate themselves to forming, helping to enable collaborations where these inventors are able to be secure, where they can proceed with their work, where they can have the input of others who have insights that can help move it along better, as well as the normal engineering expertise, legal expertise, business, marketing, all the normal stuff that goes along with the inventor of anything, whether it's a pencil to a rocket. There's very conventional aspects in the invention and in taking a product to market. And generally, these guys don't know how to do that. They need these high performance teams to be brought around them. And that's part of what I've been trying to do.
Well, and they have everything going against them, Joel, because they're going against very entrenched economic, financial, political, geopolitical power interests that are founded on the maintenance of a fossil fuel world where energy is in certain parts of the world that can be physically controlled. You control the access to those parts of the world. You have a limited number of people who extract the profits out as a result of that energy. And it's a great system for those people who control it. There's no incentive, motivation at all, it seems to me, for that system to change from their point of view. And they'll throw up every roadblock imaginable, it seems to me, for any kind of true breakthrough energy that allows the people by and large, the world's population to have, my God, cheap, super cheap, relatively free energy. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're up against a huge amount of obstacles. I'd like to talk with you about that in the next segment of this when we continue this. But for right now, that's all we've got the time for. I've really enjoyed talking with you, Joel Garbon, inventor, former president of the New Energy Movement. And by the way, Joel, do you have your own website that people can? I didn't really see a website that was explicitly yours. Did I just not look hard enough?
I do not have my own website. I am doing some of my own private work with certain inventors. I do encourage people to check out the newenergymovement.org website and check that out. And
that seems like a good place to start. There's a lot of good information in there. I was looking at it earlier. So, Joel, I really want to thank you for your time here on this segment. And that concludes this portion of my interview with Joel Garbon. To hear us continue this conversation, you can go to my website, richardolanmembers.com, where Joel and I are going to go even further. And I really would like to talk about the political ramifications and economic ramifications of this new energy, the new energy breakthroughs that are upon us. But for right now, that's it. I want to thank you for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.